Back in high school, I had 3 really close friends. There was Brad, the soccer player who could never sit still. He was the reason most of our hangouts would take us to weird parts of town exploring random places. Then there was Chuck, the driver. He was the oldest in the group, and he got his license before the rest of us. He was basically our designated driver no matter what, which worked out because he was also the most cautious in the group. The third guy was Billy. Billy was a fun guy to hang around. He produced beats for a bunch of SoundCloud rappers in the towns around us, and he was a music enthusiast. He always brought the right kind of energy to our group. It was sophomore year of high school when this happened, Thursday, October 31st, Halloween night. None of us had gone trick-or-treating for a few years now, but we still liked to hang out and explore creepy places on Halloween. It was our annual tradition. Since it was a Thursday, we planned on skipping school the next day so that we could stay out extra late. Chuck was the only one who didn't like this idea, but we eventually talked him into it. A few days before Halloween, when we were at lunch in school, Brad told us about this cornfield he had passed by on the way to his last soccer game. He said it would be the perfect place to explore on Halloween night. Billy and I agreed on the spot. Exploring a cornfield in the pitch black on Halloween night sounded like the perfect plan. Chuck went along with it, but he asked a bunch of questions. Who owns the field? Where is it? How far away is it? How big is it? Is there a good spot for me to park my car? Brad told him to stop being a pussy or we'd leave him in the cornfield. So, the plan was to meet up at Billy's house first, have dinner, and then go to the cornfield. Billy's house was the perfect spot because his dad would be taking his younger sister trick-or-treating and his mom would be handing out candy. We'd be left to our own devices. After exploring the cornfield, we'd come back to Billy's house and spend the night. By 5:30 p.m., we had all arrived at Billy's place. He had a pretty big house. Both of his parents worked in the medical field, so they made good money. Billy led us to the basement, which was basically just a huge man cave. It had a big leather couch, a flat-screen TV, and an Xbox. Billy's dad also had a bar on one side of the room that was stocked up with an assortment of alcohol. Billy handed me and Brad some beers once we got to the basement, and he told us to hide them if we heard his parents coming down the stairs. Chuck didn't say anything, but he looked a little uncomfortable. We sat there drinking, talking, and listening to some of Billy's new beats for a while. This was one of the first times I'd ever drank, so maybe it was a placebo effect, but I started to feel buzzed pretty quickly. At 7 o'clock, we cleaned up the mess we had made in the basement, and Billy ran to tell his mom that we were leaving. We all climbed into Chuck's old rust bucket, and we were off. Looking back, I actually feel pretty bad for Chuck. It was Halloween night, so there were a lot of people out walking on the roads, and he was driving much slower than usual. The entire time, the rest of us were acting like drunk idiots, blasting music way louder than we needed to, and making all sorts of obnoxious jokes. Chuck told us to shut up more than once, but we didn't really listen to him. The cornfield was a little over 30 minutes away, and we had to drive through some very isolated areas to get there. We live in the suburbs, but there are some very rural places close to our town in the direction we were headed. The change from residential neighborhoods with small yards and wire fences to open fields with farmhouses happened pretty quickly. Once we got out of the suburbs, Chuck picked up his speed a bit. We were cruising down an isolated stretch of road surrounded by empty fields when Billy unbuckled his seatbelt and stuck the top half of his body out the window. He started screaming, "Happy Halloween!" at the top of his lungs. At this point, Chuck was pissed and yelled at Billy to get back in the car. Brad and I were hunched over, laughing. Billy only got back in the car when we saw a pair of headlights approaching. Chuck closed all the windows and even turned the child's safety lock on. After another few minutes of driving, we saw the cornfield up ahead. It looked pretty big, and in the dark, it was also a little creepy. I felt some butterflies in my stomach as I gazed at the field for the first time. There were rows upon rows of corn stalks swaying gently back and forth in the breeze. It would have looked pretty in daylight, but at night, it seemed foreboding. Chuck asked Brad where he should park, and Brad told him anywhere on the side of the road. I guess in Brad's mind, he wasn't worried about cops coming through this area because it was so isolated, but Chuck didn't want to take any chances. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious, but looking back, I have to give him some credit. He wanted to find a spot where the car wasn't necessarily visible from the road. We drove around for a few more minutes before we found a little alcove to the side of the road. It was past the cornfield and a spot where the road started running through some patches of trees again. There was a dirt road leading off into the trees, almost like a trail for ATVs or something. Chuck parked the car a short way down the trail so that any passing cars wouldn't be able to spot it in the dark. We had to walk from the trail to the cornfield, which none of us really minded. It was a chilly night with a light breeze, but we all had black hoodies on. The eerie silence was occasionally disrupted by the rustling of leaves from the tree line. The cornfield looked even creepier up close. The stalks looked like an army that stretched out into the distance forever. I was definitely feeling spooked by now, but that only made me want to explore the field even more. We walked into the field, keeping our voices as hushed as we possibly could. Our shoes squished on the ground, which was still damp from the previous night's rain. Brad started whispering about how easy it would be to hide a dead body in the field, which gave me the chills. A few minutes into our exploration, Billy told us to be quiet. "Why?" I asked. "I think I heard something," he replied. "Shut up and listen." I rolled my eyes. I could clearly see where this was going. We all fell silent, and moments later Billy grabbed Chuck by the shoulders and screamed, "Look out!" while shaking him. The prank didn't really work, as Chuck had seen it coming. We kept walking, and we eventually made it to a scarecrow. It was strapped to a large wooden stake and had a straw hat and everything you would typically associate with scarecrows. It was strange, though. The closer we got to the scarecrow, the more and more the air reeked. It wasn't just a normal farm stench either. It was something much worse. We all covered our noses with our shirts. "What the hell is that?" Chuck said. I was starting to get a really bad feeling in my gut. I don't know how to describe it, but there was something in my gut telling me that we should leave. I decided to voice my feeling. "Guys, I think it's time to head out," I said. Brad gave me a weird look. "Why?" he asked. "Scared of ghosts?" I shook my head and said, "I just got a really bad feeling. I think we should leave." "You can leave anytime you want to," Brad said. Brad and Billy kept walking towards the scarecrow, and Brad even tried to take off its hat by jumping and snatching at it. Chuck and I stayed a few feet back, still covering our noses. The longer we stood there, the creepier it got. I was actually starting to feel a bit paranoid. I think Chuck was feeling the same way I was, and at one point, he turned around to watch our backs or something, and he froze. I noticed it from the corner of my eye. He had been shuffling his feet nervously just a second ago, but now he was stock still, staring at something behind us. I turned to see what he was staring at, and I froze too. There was a man in the cornfield standing a short distance behind us. He was wearing what looked like a homemade Halloween costume of a scarecrow. He was holding something in his right hand. It looked like some kind of blade, maybe a machete. I tried yelling to Brad and Billy, but my voice caught in my throat. My heart was going a mile a minute, pounding so hard against my chest that I thought it would burst out. The man was just standing there, watching us. I looked at Chuck. His eyes were wide and he was quivering slightly. I turned to Brad and Billy and finally managed to rasp, guys?" They looked back at us, then past us at the man. "Oh shit," Brad exclaimed. "What the hell?" "Let's get out of here," Chuck whispered. I couldn't have agreed more. "Run!" We all booked it through the cornfield in the opposite direction of the man. Mud and grass came spewing out of the ground under our feet as we sprinted full speed to the edge of the field. I looked over my shoulder and luckily didn't see anything, but there was no chance I was going to slow down. We finally burst out of the cornfield, but we didn't stop running then either. We sprinted all the way back to the car and Chuck floored it out of there. As we were passing the cornfield, I saw that creepy man in the scarecrow costume one last time. He was standing at the edge of the field, staring at our car. He raised his arm and waved at us as we passed. I'm glad none of us got hurt or worse, but the experience definitely shook us. We don't know what was going on in that cornfield, but it wasn't anything normal, and I don't think it was anything innocent either. That man in the scarecrow costume lives in my head rent-free. I have no clue what he was up to that night. It couldn't have been anything good. We weren't anywhere near any trick-or-treating spots, and I just can't think of any rational explanation for what he could have been doing. Chuck stopped hanging out with us shortly after this experience. Honestly, I can't blame him for that. Brad, Billy, and I kept hanging out until college, but we lost touch after we all moved away. Even if we never see each other again, I'm sure none of us will ever forget this experience.